She's joined. So I think let's not delay more. Ambassador Shankar has just joined us. So over to you, Bhavna. You can begin now.
Yeah. Am I audible, Manish?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Namaskar and hello to all joining us from India and very warm greetings, especially to our friends from Australia, Japan, and the US. I'm Bhavna Dabare, President of the Indian Futures. I take this opportunity to welcome you all today on behalf of the Indian Futures. I cannot but begin by hoping you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. Let me at the outset introduce the Indian Futures very briefly. We are a New Delhi-based independent and idea startup that started out in January 2016 with the sole aim to creating a global platform to plainly and dispassionately discuss in the truest ancient Indian tradition of a samvad, a dialogue, the ideas of New India in all their varied dimensions and contestations. The simple idea is to go beyond the headlines of the day and have an honest, deep dive conversation amongst the thinking community in India and abroad. The idea is to organize and probe our minds on a contemporary theme of critical relevance to India and the world. We are extremely proud to have recently hosted some of India's finest minds from the world of government, politics, academics, diplomacy, and culture. Shri Suresh Prabhuji, former cabinet minister, Shri Devendra Fadnavis, former CM of Maharashtra, Shri V. Muralidharanji, who joined yesterday for inaugurating our workshop, Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe, President of ICCR, Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, Chairman of NSAB, Ambassador Nirupama Menon Roy, and Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, recently retired Foreign Secretaries of India, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, former Indian Ambassador to China, Professor C. Rajamohan, Professor Makrant Paranjpeji, Director IIAS Shimla, Yamini Iyer, CPR President, and Rajiv Sardesai are just a few I have named here. Before I hand over to Manish to introduce the theme of the workshop, I would like to request you to follow us on all social media such as FB, Twitter, Insta, and YouTube, and feel free to share today's event with hashtag TIF We would love that for sure. Kindly put yourself in silent mode too to avoid any distractions in the program. Thanks again to one and all who have joined us here and on YouTube, where are we already live streaming the event. Over to you, Manish, now, who will introduce the theme of our workshop.
Thank you, Bhavna. I welcome you all today again for this very special panel, a panel very close to my heart, obviously because of the US, which still remains the numero uno par in the international system. As I said, a very early good morning to Lisa and Dhruva. Thank you for joining us. For this session, for this panel, we have got 400 plus registrations, surely a sign of the finest minds who will be speaking to us after I'm done with. To set the ball rolling in some way, let me just point out that after all the naysayers holding forth about the new President Biden walking away from Trump's so-called key disruptions, domestic and international, we now have President Biden back with a bang. Away, not talking about Asia Pacific, but really about Indo-Pacific. In fact, the March 12 Quad Summit was President Biden's initiative, very significant, obviously, on many counts, that it was the first, too early in that sense, within the first 2 months, as President Biden pointed out, the first multilateral summit by President Biden. And again, in some ways, this whole America is back public diplomacy, which we have been seeing since January of 20. The strategic signaling about, very clear signaling about the power and purpose and the process, they all seem to be perfectly aligned now to jump into for the US to jump into the geopolitical contest in the Indo-Pacific and confront China for all its acts of omission and commission. However, what does one make of, for example, the interim national security strategic guidance issued in early March, where the Biden administration hasn't been shy of suggesting cooperation with China? And here I quote, we will conduct practical, results oriented diplomacy with Beijing and work to reduce the risk of misperception and miscalculation. Unquote. I just wish to flag two concerns and maybe seek reflections from all our distinguished speakers here, and we'll stop then. The first is that despite the apparent bipartisan consensus in taking Quad ahead, will the US under Biden eventually adopt an accommodationist approach towards China and strike a deal of sorts, leaving all, including its partners, high and dry? Another very important concern: how will the internal dissonances in the US, in still a deeply divided political arena, bleak economic prospects triggered obviously by COVID, and the deep-rooted ongoing cultural wars, how would that affect US international engagements? I think these are the basic questions which seem to be agitating many minds who are looking at America very closely. And to really answer these questions and to take us through this very complex terrain, we have with us and been extremely fortunate that we could assemble really the best minds anybody can imagine. We have with us Ms. Lisa Curtis. She's a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She's a foreign policy and national security expert with over 20 years of service in the US government. That's huge, including at the NSC, CIA, State Department, and Capitol Hill. Ms. Curtis served very importantly as Deputy Assistant to the President and the NSC Senior Director for South and Central Asia from 2017 to 2021 under three successive national security advisors. Very importantly, she coordinated policies designed to strengthen the US-India defense, diplomatic and trade partnership, resulting in a widely recognized elevation of the relationship. Thank you, Ms. Curtis, for joining us today. In fact, I did see, I mean, join the Raisina dialogue virtually this time, obviously, and I can vouch that both the ambassadors, Kenneth Euster and his predecessor, Richard Verma, both of them very profusely acknowledged Ms. Curtis's role in whatever we are seeing today, the upward trajectory of US-India relations. So I think it's we are very fortunate to have her with us. Thank you again. We are also joined today by Ms. Mira Shankar. Ambassador Shankar joined the Foreign Service in July '73 and had an illustrious career spanning 38 years. She served very significantly as the director in the Prime Minister's office from '85 to '91, working on foreign policy and security matters. Very important diplomatic assignments. She served as ambassador to Germany from 2005 to '9, and her last assignment was as an ambassador of India to the US from 2009 to 2011. She really brings that solid experience as a scholar, as a very professional diplomat to the table, and I think we all are looking forward to her address. Thank you, Ambassador Shankar, for joining us. We also have with us Dhruva Jaishankar, who was a fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies at Brookings India in New Delhi and at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He is now, in fact, the first executive director of the US initiative at the Observer Research Foundation and is a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Australia. He has contributed regularly to top newspapers, journals, think tanks all over the world, and all of us, in fact, wake up many mornings to read his very intelligent, very original, very brilliant comments on different issues in the international relations. So thank you, Dhruva, for really joining us today and readily agreeing to be with us at really a very short notice. Thank you all. So without further ado, I now invite Ms. Lisa Curtis to address us. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Manish, and thank you to the Indian Futures for inviting me here today. It's really an honor to be here, and especially on the dais with two good friends and knowledgeable experts on the region, Dhruv Shankar and Mira Shankar. It seems like yesterday, Mira, when you were serving as Indian ambassador to the United States, and we worked very closely together during that time. So it's great to see you after a long while. So let me start by really extending my sincere condolences for all those who have lost their lives to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is currently raging in India. The people of the United States stand with the people of India as they face down this terrible virus. The US administration committed on Sunday to providing needed materials for vaccine production, oxygen, therapeutics like remdesivir, testing kits, PPE, and a team of advisors from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And just on a personal note, the intern that works with me at the Center for a New American Security is a young Indian American woman who is at Yale University. And she told me yesterday that every single one of her Indian American classmates has a relative who has either passed away or currently has COVID-19 in India right now. So I just wanted to let everyone know in the audience that Americans are extremely concerned about the situation in India. And we want our Indian friends to know that we will see you through this challenging time. So I was asked to talk today about US perspectives on the Quad and the Biden administration's China strategy. So let me start with the latter. President Biden has stated on several occasions, and most recently in his first address to a joint session of the US Congress on Wednesday evening, that competing with China is the administration's #1 national security and foreign policy concern. As Secretary of State Blinken said recently, when he was characterizing US-China relations, the US will be, quote, competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. The Biden administration recognizes that one of the most effective ways to compete with China is by focusing on policies that ensure US domestic industry remains competitive and that America remains the top global innovator. So today marks the Biden administration's 100th day in office. In those 100 days, the US has sanctioned Chinese officials over human rights concerns in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, agreed with the Trump administration's determination that China's treatment of its Uyghur population constitutes genocide, lifted restrictions on diplomatic engagement with Taiwanese officials, and carried out naval drills in the South China Sea. The Interim National Security Strategy, which Manish mentioned in his remarks, rightly identified the core national security threat is from China to a free, open, and rules-based international order. The strategy acknowledged that the United States must proactively counter the forces of authoritarianism by promoting democratic values and institutions throughout the world in close partnership with countries like Australia, Japan, and India. The US Congress recently introduced and is currently debating a 280-page piece of legislation called the Strategic Competition Act of 2021. This is a comprehensive blueprint for how the US should approach the China challenge on the diplomatic, economic, military, and technology fronts. The Strategic Competition Act also is the first piece of major US legislation to highlight the Quad. The bill calls on the United States to expand multiple avenues of cooperation with the Quad, including regular military-to-military dialogues, joint exercises, and coordinated policies to protect cyberspace and advance maritime security. President Biden also has issued an executive order to examine supply chains, especially with regard to semiconductor technology and batteries used in electric cars. There are several reviews taking place on China currently in the administration. And so the results of these reviews and the supply chain review will guide the administration's strategy on technology trade with China moving forward. So with the Indo-Pacific encompassing 60% of the world's population and 35% of the world's GDP, the region is certainly a driver of the world economy. China, of course, is the second largest economy, but it's expected to overtake the US to be the largest by 2028. Meanwhile, China is acting in increasingly aggressive ways, diplomatically, economically, militarily, and certainly on the digital development and technology fronts. China is seeking to control advanced industries like robotics, biotech, and AI. China is expanding its military capabilities and is hoping to see the US reduce its presence in the Indo-Pacific region. So it's now more important than ever that the Quad countries come together and increase their joint activities to deter conflict and advance prosperity in this vital region. The Quad countries must ensure that China does not dominate cutting-edge technologies. And there's a need to puncture that narrative that China's regional domination is inevitable. So as China's global competitive edge sharpens across multiple domains, it's clear that the extent to which the Quad countries can collaborate across all these domains will be an important factor in determining whether China's hegemonic designs on the Indo-Pacific will succeed. The Quad has been slow to emerge as an organized grouping. After 14 years of fits and starts, the Quad has finally begun to take shape and define its purpose. And I would say this purpose is to preserve the open, free, transparent, and rules-based order that facilitates trade, economic, and political development in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. When the Quad countries held their first meeting in May 2007, China reacted badly and sent demarches to each nation asking why they were undertaking such an initiative. Canberra and New Delhi downplayed the significance of that initial meeting, and they started to back away from the concept, casting it into cold storage for the next 10 years. In the interim, China made significant strides in its military modernization. It used its naval power to press its territorial claims in the South and East China Sea. It extended its influence into the Indian Ocean region. It ramped up aggression along its disputed borders with India, strengthened its grip on Tibet, cracked down on democracy in Hong Kong, and employed both state power and illegal means to ascend toward global technological dominance. So it's now clear the go slow approach to the Quad has neither helped to moderate Chinese behavior, nor has it delayed Beijing's attempts to bend the global order toward its authoritarian ideology. So it was nothing short of remarkable that President Biden held the first ever Quad summit within 60 days of taking power. And the four countries also released the first ever joint statement of the Quad. This meeting, of course, built on the momentum that the Trump administration had started. The Trump administration had revived the Quad in 2017 and painstakingly brought it to the point where a summit-level meeting this year was possible. The establishment of the three working groups on vaccines, climate change, and emerging and critical technologies will help focus the efforts of the Quad. But I think there should also be consideration toward establishing a more formal secretariat to track and monitor Quad initiatives. There are several technology-related issues on which the Quad must act, whether it is building an international consensus around open access 5G networks that will provide alternatives to Huawei's technology, or whether it's cooperating to establish critical infrastructure like undersea cables. There is so much work to do. The Quad needs to consider how to effectively pool its resources and diplomacy and lead standard setting and regulatory efforts and enhance collective undersea domain awareness. Because the concerns regarding undersea cables stem from the lessons that we have learned from the 5G challenge, where China has sought to dominate the market through providing state subsidies to its own companies and by controlling the standard setting process. Now, the joint investment in 5G technology that was announced just 2 weeks ago when Japanese President Suga visited the White House is a positive step. But again, there's so much more that the Quad can do to create alternatives to Chinese technology offerings. So managing the COVID crisis is certainly the first order of business of the Quad, and seeing India through this very challenging current COVID storm is certainly where all of our countries' attention lies. But looking to the future, the Quad should collaborate on other important issues, including maritime security and providing infrastructure alternatives to South and Southeast Asian nations. So with so much work to be done and the Quad just beginning to hit its stride, it's imperative that none of the Quad countries bend to Chinese pressure and again back away from this grouping, such as what happened 14 years ago. Because the misconception that placating China by avoiding collaboration among like-minded democracies might somehow make Beijing a friendlier or more cooperative partner has certainly been laid bare. The need for Quad collaboration is both urgent and it's long past due. So that concludes my remarks, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa, for really laying out very systematically, very comprehensively what exactly is the Biden's China strategy, and obviously how competing with China is the first strategic priority, is the first foreign policy concern which has been flagged repeatedly by senior officials in the Biden administration. Very important, you really flagged for us the Strategic Competition Act 2021, which is a very significant piece of legislation, as you rightly pointed out, also talking about Quad. But I think, as you clearly mentioned and pointed out, that it is early days for the Biden administration, and a strategic review of sorts is happening on the supply chains and other issues. I think that's we all need to also understand that. Laying out again very brilliantly the Quad agenda. I think the most important point, the most important glue that really binds all the four countries in the Indo-Pacific is really China. And despite, as you said, false starts which go back to, in fact, 2007. In fact, China has really brought these four countries together, and the strategic purpose is now, again, thanks to China and Chinese aggressive actions and behavior, is really to promote rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. Obviously, in terms of diplomatic agenda, the 5G networks, critical infrastructure, and obviously we all are battling COVID, especially in India. The situation is pretty bad, very bad actually. But I think that's really the first order of business for Quad, and we saw very significant aid coming from the US, and I think the country and everyone at large is very pleased that finally this is the first thing which should have come much earlier, but it is now happening, and the country is very pleased about this. That finally the Quad and countries like the US are getting their act together and coming to the aid of India. And very important, I think, that the last point, that ultimately the Quad countries need to really understand that despite the economic interdependencies with China, placating China now or even earlier was not an option at all. So it is so very important that the like-minded countries, democratic countries, shared values of liberalism. I think that that those ties, those values need to be bringing all these four countries together and really shaping collaboratively in the Indo-Pacific region. So thank you for that, for those very brilliant remarks. With this, I now invite Ambassador Mira Shankar to address us. Over to you, ma'am. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Manish. And I'm glad that you focused on this subject at this time. It's very timely. I appreciate the remarks that Lisa has made. And what we see from those is that despite the apprehensions that there could be a shift in US policy towards China under the Biden administration, this has not come to pass. And we see that despite the differences politically, which may be there in the United States on issues of domestic policy, there is a strong bipartisan consensus with regard to the policy with China. So Biden has continued with the tariffs which the Trump administration had put on China. And again, despite the doubts whether Biden would continue with the Quad, he has in fact given it prominence and primacy by holding the first ever summit of the Quad and also having that as his first multilateral meeting, which was held virtually. So I think the signaling is very clear. China is a concern to all these countries. Its hegemony or efforts to establish hegemony in Asia are something which need to be balanced and contested. And at the same time, work has to be done to see that the technological competition which China has unleashed is met in a more balanced way with more options for the world rather than over-dependence on any one country. So I think on these there is consensus. Where there are questions is that each of these countries, whether it is Japan or Australia or the US or India, have concerns about China. Australia, because China has sought to impose economic sanctions on them. Japan, because of the territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands. The US has been because of their trade war and increasing strategic competition. India with an unsettled border and aggressive Chinese behavior on the border. But at the same time, each of these countries also has equities in China. So for Australia, China is the biggest export market because their commodities go there. For Japan, they have major investments in China. And again, it's a major export market. For the US, it's a major source of imports, as well as a big holder of US treasuries, even though it's been lessening the amount of treasuries that they hold. And for India, China is right at the border. So at some level, there is a kind of dual policy, if you will, that the countries follow. For instance, Australia continues to have China as its main economic partner, while its strategic links and its strategic partnership is with the US. The same would hold for Japan. Both Japan and Australia are alliance partners of the US strategically. India is not an ally, but a strategic partner. And for the US, their economic equities in China continue to be strong. because though efforts are being made to technologically compete with China, I think the ability of the US to, what could I say, economically de-link from China would be constrained by the extent of the intermeshing which has already taken place. So there may be limitations in terms of what the Quad will do or can do. But I think it's a good thing that the Quad has got off the ground, and that the pressure which China had initially put after the first meeting of the Quad, which caused countries to back away, has been withstood. It's a flexible alliance of democracies which sees its major objective as being to support and enhance and secure prosperity and security in the Indo-Pacific, including a free and open Indo-Pacific with the freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, which is rooted in international law and free from coercion. The recent summit issued a joint statement which identified immediate crises, the pandemic, climate change, and critical technologies as being areas in which the Quad will work together. On the pandemic, they agreed that they will produce 1 billion vaccines for distribution in the Indo-Pacific, and that this will be done in close collaboration with each other and with the WHO. The Critical Technologies Working Group is going to look at standard setting, at technologies in telecommunications, including 5G, and at creating resilient supply chains, including for issues or for commodities like semiconductors and rare earths or critical raw materials. And there is also going to be a group on cyberspace, because the US has been subjected to cyber attacks from China, as have Australia, Japan, and India. So again, this is an area on which the countries have agreed to work together. In addition, of course, maritime security has been identified as a core area for Quad cooperation, though the contours of that are still fluid and being defined. It's interesting that, for instance, India now, even though it's not an alliance partner of the US, now has various logistic agreements with the US, as well as with Japan and with Australia bilaterally. And that we have carried out military drills together, including the Malabar exercise, in which for the first time Australia was also invited. But still, this is an area which is being shaped, and what the contours of this collaboration are going to look like in future is something which is a work in progress. Overall, the Biden administration has showed determination in its policy with regard to China, and perhaps a bit more sense of purpose and willingness to put its money where its mouth is with regard to developing the technologies in America to be able to compete with China, rather than only relying on restrictive actions or sanctions, because I think that would be the way forward. Really to have options and alternatives, and to work together for those options and alternatives. At the same time, I think the Biden administration has said that it will not eschew cooperation with China on international issues. And they have defined the pandemic, climate change, nuclear proliferation, and terrorism as the four areas where they could perhaps try to work with China in the international arena, if it is possible. So again, it will be somewhat of a dual track of dialogue as well as competition. It's not going to be a unilateral track of pure competition. Jake Sullivan has clarified that the Quad is not a military alliance. It is not an Asian NATO. It is a flexible group of democratic countries working together to promote shared objectives in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, democratic values are very much a part of the grouping, and indeed important to posit alternatives to the lure of authoritarianism, which China has been seeking to hold out as a model for accelerating development for developing countries. So in that sense, I think it is also value-based because it posits an alternative view of the world. Overall, I think it's still something which is a work in progress, but I agree with Lisa that having a secretariat would ensure that, whatever decisions are agreed upon don't fall through the cracks between meetings, and that there is a systematic effort to pursue the objectives which have been outlined. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those very clear-headed remarks. Obviously, you rightly shared the apprehensions which many of us had about shift of approach to China under the new Biden presidency, but we can now visibly see that there is a real bipartisan consensus on even how to take even Trump's China policy ahead by the Biden administration, obviously symbolized very substantively by the March 12 summit, which was really a clear signal to China in many ways. The very important point which you highlighted for us, that ultimately it is going to be a dual sort of policy by states, by the Quad states, including Japan and Australia, coming to India. Obviously, India is not an alliance partner, security partner, a treaty partner in that sense, but India does remain a strategic partner for the US. Again, you rightly flagged a very important point, that decoupling in that sense by China, by the United States. I think that looks distant and far, and not easily possible, obviously because the economic equities with China for the US still remain very, very strong. And you also beautifully unpacked the joint statement, the March 12 joint statement, the spirit of the Quad, where you had three working groups, different arenas of cooperation, including maritime safety, and very importantly, the Malabar exercises, which happened last year. In conclusion, obviously, and many would agree with this, that Biden, in fact, really has brought, in that sense, a positivity about Quad in the Indo-Pacific, and it really posits, as you said in your own words, an alternative vision, an alternative idea about the world order, specifically in the Indo-Pacific theater. And in some ways, we all also need to temper down our hopes, our expectations about Quad transforming or transmutating into a NATO sort of structure in Asia. I think those are very valid reflections which we all can further debate. So thank you, Ambassador, for those very brilliant remarks. I now invite Dhruva to share his remarks. Over to you, Dhruva.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you for inviting me, and it is a pleasure to be on this panel with Lisa Curtis and Ambassador Mira Shankar. Both both had such wide-ranging and thoughtful remarks that there's very little I can add to the discussion, and I would agree with everything that has been said so far. What I'll do is just in 5 minutes, I thought I would just highlight, in some ways, recap a few key points. One, why we have seen in some ways this transition, this continuity from the Biden administration, from the Trump administration to the Biden administration on this issue at a time of increasing political polarization in the US on many issues, particularly domestic issues. Second, sort of what does a future Quad agenda look like, or what could it look like? And finally, a few sort of points of warning or caution about where some of the anticipated challenges that the Quad may face in the coming months and years ahead. Before doing that, I just do want to add that while I'm based in the US, I'm obviously from India. I have my family is there, and at this point of time, the number one priority for a lot of us is the coronavirus pandemic and concern about what is happening there. And in some ways, it's been very encouraging to see in the last few days even the immense outpouring of support in the US, not just from the US government, which has kicked into gear in terms of providing assistance. And we had the first shipment of supplies arrive yesterday from the US, but equally US corporations and individuals who've been donating to support people in need in India at this point of time. In some ways, it's a very natural thing for India to have supported other countries at times when there was a great need for vaccines and other supplies in those countries. And it is only natural now that when India is in a time of need, that its partners, and again, not just governments, but non-governmental entities are coming in to support India. So hopefully we'll see more of that in the next few days and weeks. Turning back to the Quad, again, the Quad is very unusual in US policy over the last 6 months, in that it has been one of the rare areas where a Biden administration, a Democratic Biden administration, and a Republican Trump administration, where there's very little overlap in their agendas, both domestic and to a lesser degree foreign agendas. And yet this is one area where we've seen not just a continuity, but an acceleration of effort by the two administrations. And so I think an important question to ask is, why is that the case? And I would basically say there are four main key reasons for this. One, as Lisa rightly laid out in much more detail, is that there is a growing bipartisan assessment of China as a peer competitor of the United States, and that has certain implications for the US and for its economy, for its national security, and so forth. And these are concerns that Beijing has done very little to dispense with, as was seen at the first summit held by a senior meeting held by the US officials, that is the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, with their rough counterparts, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi in Alaska. So that, I think, is sort of obviously the first point, which is that there is this growing bipartisan consensus. And while there is some sort of dissenting notes, particularly from parts of the private sector, from parts of the policy establishment, overall there has been a major shift in how the US leadership across both parties is looking at the China challenge. The second reality, I think, is that unlike the immediate post-Cold War period, the US is also confronting an issue of limited resources. And I think there was a sort of an accustomed thinking after the end of the Cold War that the US economy, the US technology was so far ahead of any potential peer competitor that, in a sense, it could think and plan to outspend and outcompete any potential competitor. And today, I think there is a reality. The reality is sinking in that those resources are limited for in its competition with China. And this will in turn require burden sharing from others. So, in parallel to the Quad, you have seen efforts by, again, successive administrations, from the Obama administration to the Trump to Biden, to call on US partners and allies to also contribute more in various ways to global public goods. A third reality, I think, is the sort of dawning of the realization that trade is intensely political, that it's no longer just in the realm of technocratic or economic policy making what is best for the overall economy. It now has significant political implications at home, and in some ways, there were many reasons why President Trump was elected, but there was clearly an economic dimension to his messaging as well. And again, this resonates in very different ways, perhaps, but it resonates similarly on the right amongst Republicans, but also on the left amongst Democrats. And as such, we are seeing a sort of, we may see a period of where trade deals, at least these sort of mega trade deals such as TPP, will be more difficult to pursue and to conclude, often for political reasons. Again, so some of these may happen. TPP may one day be back on the table, but it's very hard to see that happen in the near immediate future. But at the same time, there are those concerns about resilience of supply chains. There is a growing acknowledgement that your trade partners and your political partners, your diplomatic partners, a greater alignment of that contributes to security. And so again, while any ambitious trade deals may for the near future be off the table, there is a sense that cooperation on supply chains, on technology, and other forms of international economic cooperation are mutually beneficial amongst partners. Finally, one area where there's actually some difference, but in a strange way, very different worldviews come together, is concerns multilateralism. And while, again, the Trump administration and the Biden administration have taken very different views when it comes to multilateral agreements, whether it's the Paris Climate Treaty, whether it is the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal, whether it is the reform of UN-led institutions, that there is a sense that the existing institutions are insufficient to meet the needs of today. So again, while the Biden administration has decided to lean into some of these institutions more aggressively, but there is still an underlying concern. And so again, the seeking out new partners and new configurations is another area where the two, although they have two very different starting points, the two policies have converged. So for all of these reasons, I think we have seen this level of continuity when it comes to the Quad and the Biden administration accelerate. Getting to where could the Quad go forward? Tanvi Madan, who's at the Brookings Institution, and I recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where we outline what does a future Quad agenda look like. And broadly speaking, I think we highlight four areas. One is deepening security cooperation. So currently, for example, the Quad dialogues are led by the foreign ministries. Would it be possible to add a stronger security component to it, whether it's the defense ministries or national security councils, and at what level? So I think that's one area worth exploring. A second is improving the quality of military exercises. While we now have Malabar and you have a growing number of bilateral and trilateral exercises amongst the Quad countries, can they be made to a more spontaneous, more action-oriented, and focused on specific scenarios where the four, or at least some subset of the four, can come together with real outcomes. And finally, I think one area which has been underdeveloped has been defense industrial cooperation. The US defense industrial cooperation with the other three countries has been improving, including with India, but the cooperation amongst the other three, Japan, India, and Australia, still remains at a very basic level. There is some opportunities being explored amongst all three countries, but very little yet to show for it. The second broad area in terms of the future agenda, it involves widening cooperation. We saw some of that at the summit, to public health, to cybersecurity, to supply chain resilience, and to new technologies, amongst other areas. And so there are ways in which the agenda can broaden. The one aspect of this is it will now involve ministries beyond the traditional foreign and defense establishment. It will involve coordinating better with various line ministries, and it will also involve non-governmental entities, so subject matter experts, academic, scholarly communities, the private sectors. So bringing them, and in some cases, having them lead efforts at deepening cooperation and coordination. A third aspect of the agenda is in terms of more focused help of other partners. So when there is a need, say, for countries in Southeast Asia or in the Indian Ocean region or in the South Pacific, whether it's disaster relief, whether it's vaccine diplomacy or other areas, the Quad coming together to help in those efforts. The big vaccine initiative announced is perhaps the best example of that, but perhaps we can see that in other areas as well going forward. And finally, on multilateralism, the 4 countries, or at least 3 of the 4 countries, are members of many key international institutions. All 4 are G20 member states, for example. All 4 are members of the UN, not always the UN Security Council at the same time. So, informal coordination at multilateral organizations remains another area. And in terms of the agenda laid out by Lisa and Ambassador Shankar in terms of setting standards and regulatory issues, particularly for new and emerging technologies, this will be an area where a lot of those standards and regulations are set multilaterally. So this, in some sense, represents the sweep of what is possible now. Now that the summit has taken place, now that the Quad has been elevated in people's attention. Finally, let me end on sort of just a few points of concern. One is, I think we will still see, particularly among skeptical viewpoints in all 4 countries, a rush to judgment every time there is a perceived setback, sometimes even in the bilateral relationship amongst some Quad countries. So even last week, when there was the view that the US had been slow to respond to India's coronavirus pandemic, there was a lot of idle commentary that the Quad is useless, the Quad is this is a major setback. How can India trust the US on? And again, that overlooks a lot of other things. For example, the vaccine initiative was really meant for other countries, not the four Quad members, and would in any case have only come online later in 2021 or early 2022. So the idea of looking at every setback as or every difference in viewpoint, and there will be differences of viewpoint going forward, as some kind of major having major implications for the Quad partnership, I think is a bit short-sighted, but I suspect we will see quite a lot of that in the years ahead. The second sort of area, I think, is the concern that the Quad could bite off more than it can chew. I laid out a very wide agenda, and yet the reality is the Quad won't be able to do everything, and certainly not everything well. So in some sense, I think a constant concern will be in the future, will climate change be, even though there is a working group, will that be a step too far? Will that aspect of cooperation not proceed as quickly as some of the other areas of cooperation and coordination? So in that sense of flexibility, a certain sense of flexibility may still be required. Finally, both the co-panelists mentioned the possibility of a secretariat going forward, to give it more, a more streamlined agenda, ensure deliverables, ensure that sort of more permanence to the group. And while that may be a positive, maybe a possibility, and maybe welcome, I think that there's always a concern that about the over bureaucratization of any international institution. So just to give some examples, the BRICS, or certainly SARC, BIMSTEC, all do have secretariats, but that doesn't always mean that they are the most effective or nimble international organizations or partnerships. So again, I don't think that should mean that should be ruled out, but certainly something that should be kept in mind as the Quad develops its agenda. So with that, I'll end my remarks, and I look forward to a discussion.
Thank you, Dhruva, for really, I think that was really a brilliant presentation and very systematic, very coherent, moving in a very specific direction. Obviously, you started out with, I mean, four key reasons why you see Biden pushing ahead Trump agenda in many ways, despite knowing the huge political divide in the Republican within Republican and between Republican and the Democratic administrations. I think those four reasons, bipartisan consensus that China is a real competitor, US obviously having limited resources, and again, very important point. I think you talked about that trade ultimately has acquired political overtones even internally. I think that is a very original point you have made. Obviously, then the trajectory of Quad. What exactly are the larger domains in which Quad is going to be focusing on, and obviously the key challenges, and in fact, exactly last week's developments immediately. You saw the naysayers saying Quad is rubbish, Quad doesn't work, Quad would not matter, and if Americans can't come to our aid, what is the point of Quad? I think all these naysayers have vanished into thin air, obviously because of the conversation between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden, and many other conversations after that, including the aid which has come yesterday. Very important point also about to what extent would having the secretariat push the agenda forward, I think also remains to be discussed further. So I think thank you again for those very brilliant remarks. With this, now we open up the Q&A, and maybe I can start with Lisa. I mean, there are two specific questions which I have in mind. To what extent the status of Taiwan is going to be a litmus test for US's or Biden's China strategy, and again for Quad. So I think that's I mean, if you can reflect on that, and again. Many would say that this is really coming of the West together vis-a-vis China. But you also see a slight divergence in how, for example, European Union is looking at China. So could you please reflect on these two, questions?
Thank you very much. On the issue of Taiwan, obviously this is the top concern right now between the U.S. and China, and Chinese provocative actions in the Taiwan Strait area have been extremely concerning. But I think that the Biden administration has met some of those tests that we see China putting on it. You know, shortly after the inauguration, we saw China stepping up its military actions in this area. So I think what we have seen is that the Biden administration has made very clear that it will, defend Taiwan, that China needs to stop these provocative actions, that they would have consequences. We've heard President Biden say this on many occasions, that Chinese provocative military actions, particularly with regard to Taiwan, would have consequences. So I think that the Biden administration has sort of met that initial test that China was doing, the kind of probing to see how far they could go, putting pressure on Taiwan. But still, I think this will remain a very important issue, and will continue to add tension between the US and China for a long time to come. And with regard to Taiwan and its what the Quad might do, I think that's a very interesting question. You might have seen 2 weeks ago when the Japanese leader was in Washington, that the statements on Taiwan became a source of tension in that Japan, favored being a bit more cautious than the US on this issue. So I think it would be difficult for the Quad to really do anything jointly with regard to Taiwan. I also think that would be a major red line for China. So at this particular stage, it may not be advisable for the Quad to really be active in any way on the Taiwan issue. But I would say that Taiwan has a very important voice in terms of being, a democracy that is, having to face down Chinese disinformation campaigns, technology, infiltrating into Taiwan's technology networks, facing cybersecurity challenges. And so the Quad would have something to learn by coordinating with Taiwan. So if there's a way to have a sort of dialogue between the Quad and Taiwan, I think this could be very useful. But when it comes to sort of any kind of joint statement by the Quad, that would seem to be a no-go area right now. And then I think your second question was on the EU strategy. Of course, the EU released its Indo-Pacific strategy quite recently, about a week or so ago. And I do think there were some definite commonalities between the US strategy, or the developing strategy. Of course, the US hasn't laid out its China strategy in any great detail, but as we see it sort of gradually unfolding, I see a lot of overlap with regard to the EU and it focusing more. Of course, the EU doesn't have the naval assets, except for some countries. The French obviously have maritime assets that they deploy to the region, and we've seen that just recently with the naval exercises involving France. The UK also sending its first ever, not first ever, but in a long time, aircraft carrier to the region. So I think that, again, the Quad can sort of have a dialogue with the EU about strategies toward the Indo-Pacific. But I think it's interesting that we clearly see the US, India, Japan, and Australia, and even as a grouping and as individual countries, have more urgency to their China strategies. They're more impacted directly by China right now. And so I do think that the gravity of the US strategy toward China is going to fall more toward the Quad than the EU. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be cooperating with the European partners, finding areas where we can work together. But it's just to say that I think the primary effort in the Indo-Pacific will be with the Quad.
Great, Ms. Curtis. Over to you, Ambassador Shankar. You raised a very valid point about the strong economic equities, which in fact all four have vis-a-vis China. So in that sense, do we see Quad in fact already circumscribed in many ways because of this? Could you reflect on that a bit more? Please unmute yourself, ma'am.
Yes, part of the effort of the Quad is to, reduce vulnerabilities of this economic dependence on China in critical areas. So in that sense, it's something where they are seeking to at least, de-link in critical technologies and in areas such as telecommunications, or look at resilient supply chains, which means diversification from over-dependence on any particular country where there could be disruption in supplies, like Japan, between China and Japan, when China put a block on the export of rare earths and materials, or post the pandemic in China, when a whole range of materials got disrupted from supply all over the world. So de-risking, in a sense, is going to be a very important part of the Quad strategy going forward. And how they are able to actually give this concrete shape by creating diversification of supplies, I think is going to be a factor in how successful they will be in their effort to balance China. So while the economic dependencies are there, the equities are there, and I think complete delinking nobody is looking at, yet I think the Quad has identified critical areas where it seeks to develop alternatives and to de-risk. So I think that will be an important element of the strategy going forward.
Great, Ambassador. Dhruva, if I can ask you, there's this what we are seeing is a lot of conversation and a lot of if you see the statements talking about ASEAN centrality. So how do you see that really impacting on how Quad is looking at the Indo-Pacific, and to what extent this whole notion of ASEAN centrality, because ASEAN at times is a divided house. So I mean, how do you see that really playing out? In the Quad positioning in the Indo-Pacific?
Right. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting to think back about, why we, how did ASEAN centrality as an idea even come about? ASEAN, in its initial phase, when the first 5 members came together, it was very much an anti-communist bloc that emerged in Southeast Asia, with the 5 countries really all being broadly pro-US tilting regimes during the Cold War. That's Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia. And it was only later that it took on more of a this idea that we now associate with ASEAN about this sort of lowest common denominator, consensus-driven organization with the incorporation of Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Brunei. So again, this idea that ASEAN, as we think of it today, is somehow set in stone, is not, does not bear out beyond the past few decades. Interestingly enough, during the 80s and 90s, it assumed what we think of, what we now associate ASEAN with, which is a sort of central convening place in Asia. It came about at a time when the major powers were in fact a bit more preoccupied. It was after the Vietnam War, when the US withdrew from Vietnam. The Soviet Union had its own preoccupations. China was more internally focused in the 80s and 90s. India wasn't playing nearly the same role. Japan was playing an economic role, but certainly not a military role in the same way. So again, it's a very unusual situation that the smaller countries of Southeast Asia became the central focus for institutional organization in the larger region. This again stands in contrast to Europe, where it was really Germany and France coming together that formed the basis of the European Union and the growth of that organization. So it comes to a time now where, as you mentioned correctly, this notion of ASEAN acting as the sort of central authority is under a great deal of stress, because there are internal divisions, sometimes being put on them. And in part, it is because of that the Quad has had to come up. In some ways, if we, the reason I think there is that lip service that has to be paid to ASEAN centrality, apart from the fact that I think all 4 Quad countries do believe that a strong ASEAN is good, strong unified ASEAN is good, and that it is reassuring the ASEAN member states that the efforts of the Quad are not meant to undermine ASEAN centrality, but actually meant to reinforce ASEAN centrality. And that is a message that I think that will have to be repeated ad nauseum by all 4 partners for the foreseeable future, because there are these somewhat somewhat convenient narratives that are being pushed that the Quad and associated efforts are somehow undermining ASEAN and making it less relevant. And I think that the idea is actually to reinforce ASEAN. But some of it is somewhat frustrating because there are many other initiatives, some involving ASEAN member states that do not seem to raise the same red flags. You don't see the same red flags being raised about TPP or BIMSTEC or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or anything else. Somehow, the Quad is singled out for it. And I think that does serve certain vested interests that would like to criticize the Quad. So again, keeping in mind that sort of skeptical notion, I think this is why it is important to constantly reassert the importance of ASEAN centrality and unity.
Great. I think that was a great response. So with this, we invite questions from the participants. So we can begin with the Wing Commander Puneet. So Puneet, please introduce yourself and then shoot your question. Puneet, please unmute yourself. Oh.
Good evening. I am Wing Commander Puneet Chadda. I am a PhD scholar at Central University of Gujarat at Gandhinagar in School of Security Studies. I have a very simple question. We were observing something that US Navy in the beginning of April 21 conducted a freedom of navigation operation in India's EEZ without requesting for India's consent. And USS Paul Jones maintained that it is consistent with the US policy. Now, we are a Quad partner, and surely if we requested, India would have never said no. And so what I would like to ask is, was this a faux pas, an aberration, or a signaling how US views Quad, and whether India is considered a lesser partner in Quad? And of course, even the other alliance partners who are Australia and Japan, maybe they could have issued a measured statement from them, their side that probably this is not okay. And we could have had much more trust issues sorted out. So may I invite comments from Lisa on this? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have Chandan first? Yeah, Chandan, go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes. Good evening, sir, and thank you so much. I have a questions for Dhruva Shankar. Before I ask my questions, let me take this opportunity to thanks Dhruva. Whenever I ask something to him on Twitter, he is always very prompt. So thank you, Dhruva. My questions is, as an academician, how you see Quad as an organization in the discipline of IR theoretically? So that is my questions. And I have two observations to make. First is Quad really reflecting the new world order with changing context? And second is is it Quad is only about balancing China or managing China, or is it something else? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take another question? Aditya, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, everyone, for such a wonderful presentation. My name is Aditya Kumar Singh, and I'm pursuing my master's from SISJNU. So I have a very different question. It's not really related to China. One of the prominent statement we hear from our Foreign External Affairs Minister, Dr. Shankar, that Quad is not against anybody. It's for something. So I have a question about, can Quad play some kind of a role in Afghanistan post-US withdrawal? Because all of the members have played or are involved in Afghanistan, so that it can give credibility to this very commonly used phrase. And second question, I've really been trying to get an answer. So I would request Ms. Curtis to answer this question. Is there any planning in the United States or among the Quad countries to come up with some kind of counter to BRI? Can they have secretariat, as Ambassador Shankar mentioned? Secretariat would play a good role. So is there any planning to come up with any kind of infrastructural program in the region to counter BRI? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aditya. Can we have Ms. Lisa to respond?
Okay, I'll go backwards. So the last speaker asked about efforts by the Quad to counter BRI, and if we can focus specifically on that. And I think that's very important, and it is something that the Quad has begun to talk about, but more could be done. And as I was saying, right now, the focus is on pandemic, and particularly India's struggle right now with the pandemic. But as the Quad shifts to other important areas, technology is obviously one of them. But I agree that BRI and providing other countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia, alternatives to Chinese infrastructure lending is extremely important. Now, there have been initial efforts between the US, Australia, and Japan. They have signed an MOU so that their credit agencies can work together in putting together financial packages for projects. Unfortunately, there's only been one that I know of so far, which was to lay an undersea cable to Palau, the Pacific island nation of Palau. So I think we need to see more proof of concept that this can actually work, that at least the 3 countries, but also eventually the 4, with India included, can pool their resources and financial tools to be able to provide alternatives. As I've said, we're not going to match China dollar for dollar, but if we can combine and pool our resources and efforts, and then show that what our countries have to offer will benefit the recipient countries more than they will from BRI. One of the big complaints BRI is that China brings in its own workers, that it doesn't really create jobs for the countries themselves. Also, Western companies, particularly the US, provide technical assistance. We transfer that technical knowledge when US companies invest in those countries. So there are a lot of benefits to Western investment, or potentially the Quad countries coming together and providing those alternatives. So I think that's very important. Thank you for that. I think the other question that was directed specifically at me was about the recent FONUP that the U.S. conducted in waters that India claims as its EEZ. So, I'm not in the government, so I cannot speak for the government or anything like that. But what I can say is that I do think that even though the US, I think, was trying to make the statement that these FONUPs are based on principles and not just about the US confronting China, I think that was probably the point that was being made. And of course, these have been done in the past on several occasions, but it was noticed more in India, I think, because there has been this greater cooperation among the Quad. So the US probably needs to take that into account and at least do things differently, whether it is either explaining what they're doing or quietly notifying. There does need to be a recognition that the situation is evolving and changing. And so that issue probably could have been handled better by the US. I would grant you that, but the intention was not to signal any disinterest in the Quad. It was not to signal that, India was somehow a lesser member of the Quad, which I think the speaker alluded to. Definitely not. I think it was sort of business as usual, trying to show that the US does these FONUPs based on principles, maritime principles. But I can understand the Indian frustration, and perhaps it could have been handled in a better way by the US.
Thank you, Ms. Curtis. Maybe President Shankar could respond. I think okay, yeah, yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to add to what Lisa said on the freedom of navigation operations. Granted that the US has been doing this on the basis of maritime principle and that they have done it in the waters of India before and in other countries. But I think this was the first time they put out this explicit statement, which kind of drew attention to itself. And while it might be, the US way of demonstrating that it's country agnostic when it applies these operations, I think it's bad strategy. It's bad strategic partnerships. So I would hope that their future policies are going to be tempered a bit by strategic imperatives.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dhruva, over to you for the last word.
Yes, a few things. One question directed at me. I'm not a theorist. I'm not an academic, although I do try to pay attention to those trends, and I do think it's important to look at to tie policy to the theoretical world. I would suggest that I wrote an article about this. In fact, that prior to the Cold War, you had balancing behavior short of alliances. And in fact, it was quite common. You did not have countries working together, coordinating amongst each other, helping each other in various ways, but falling short of a mutual defense treaty. And it was really only during the Cold War and the nuclear age that this notion of watertight alliances and a commitment began to assume a greater prominence in reality, but also that influenced the academic literature on the subject. So I see it as classical balancing behavior. You have this throughout history, and the Quad fits quite neatly into that as far as I can see. Is China the only reason? I don't think China. I would hesitate to say that China is the primary reason for the Quad. Is the only reason. I do think it is the primary reason. That is, it is Chinese behavior that is accelerating the pace of change of cooperation. And if it were not for that, we would not see the four countries coming together in the same way and at the same rate and the same intensity that you might otherwise have. But I would say there are other reasons for it. I think as I mentioned previously, the lack of sufficient multilateral institutions in the Indo-Pacific would itself be a reason for cooperation like the Quad, and that if there were more effective alternatives, that I think those would have been explored. And additionally, I think as you have four countries rising. I mean, Indian growth over the past 20 years. Japan remilitarizing, Australia even growing and in its own way, then it's only natural that you would see greater expectations on the part of these countries to play a greater role in the region. So there are other reasons beyond China, but I would personally view assess that China has been the primary driving factor. Just quickly touch upon some of the other questions, although they weren't directed to me. Is Afghanistan? I think there are other actors at play in Afghanistan. So while there is shared interest amongst the Quad countries, one has to take into account, of course, the wishes of the Afghan people, but also other actors that play important roles, including Iran, China, Russia, and Pakistan as well. So I'm not sure the Quad is the best mechanism for dealing with the future of Afghanistan, although we may see it come up as well in quadrilateral conversations in the future. On FONOPS, I would agree with the other speakers that the US has been conducting freedom of navigation operations for many years, including against India, including against US allies for many years. They appear publicly in reports. They usually get a short mention. The difference this time was that there was a very public statement by the Navy that focused people's attention on the issue, and that I think was inadvisable and led to quite naturally to the criticism that we saw. Will there be continued differences in terms of perceptions of freedom of navigation by the US and India going forward? I think there will be. These are long-standing issues. But I would agree with the other speakers. I don't see it as fundamentally undercutting quadrilateral cooperation, although it could have been certainly handled much better. Finally, on BRI, everything Lisa said is great. I would just add one thing, which is why one of the challenges the 4 Quad countries face is the limited ability of the 4 governments to contribute institutional investment into major mega infrastructure projects in the same way that the Chinese government can marshal those resources. Now, again, that is expanding, and the exception, by the way, was Japan, where there is a great deal of coordination between the Japanese state and the private sector in these kinds of efforts. In fact, there was a good article in the Wall Street Journal about a year or two ago, called, I think it was called Japan's BRI, which actually mapped that Japanese overseas investment, in fact, at the time was marginally higher than Chinese BRI investment overseas. It just doesn't get the same kind of political blowback. To give one example, Japan is investing in 6 ports in Indonesia, but you don't see any kind of global attention being paid to it. Now, with the exception of Japan, India, Australia, and the US are all somewhat limited in their ability to marshal resources. The US has made some changes on the legislative end with the BUILD Act to increase the pool to $60 billion through the DFC that it can invest. India has also increased its basket of overseas investment. There's been about $25 billion of lines of credit extended to other countries since 2003, and that amount has been growing mostly with every year. So again, this is all a way of saying that things are happening, but I do want to stress that there are these challenges and these limitations in as to why the 4 countries cannot do more on BRI. The one thing I think Lisa may have mentioned this briefly. There is a Blue Dot network, which is which is a way of ensuring essentially quality of infrastructure projects. There has been some discussion with India on this, although I'm not sure what progress has been made on that. But that's something that the Australia and Japan have been very invested in as well.
Yep. Thank you, Dhruva. I think this is a perfectly disciplined sort of panel we have had since yesterday. Bang on time. It's just 8, and we have wrapped up and we have come to an end. So over to you, Prafulat, for a formal vote of thanks.
On behalf of the team Indian Futures, I would like to thank our speakers, Lisa Curtis, Ambassador Mira Kumar, and Dhruva Shankar, who honored this session with their insightful, detailed, and scholarly thoughts. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our participants for their incisive, deep, and engaging questions. Thank you all for making this workshop a great success. We all look forward to connecting with you through our social media channels, platforms on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Stay tuned for our future workshops and sessions. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Ambassador Shankar, Lisa, and Dhruva, thank you so much. Please take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor, for such a wonderful brainstorming session.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe.